Most federal, state, and local government land in the Mid-Atlantic and Lower Lake States region is found along the Appalachian Mountain Range. All Appalachian states have between 12 and 18% government land, compared to less than 10% in the remaining states. The federal gap analysis is completed or nearing completion in all states except Indiana, Illinois, and Delaware. The gap analysis shows that with the exception of Pennsylvania, only a very small portion of government land can be easily converted to fully protected wildlands. For reasons not explained, wildlands biologists in the state of Pennsylvania have designated almost all state land as protected or nearly protected. This is gradually changing. The U.S. Forest Service has designated roadless areas that are designed to be turned into wilderness areas. The U.S. Congress and New Jersey created the Pinelands Protection Area in 1978 and 79, and Congress passed the Highlands Conservation Act in late 2004 that extends across New Jersey and Pennsylvania. Both of these areas extend the powers of the state to regulate land use and acquire land for protection purposes. In another example, the Southern Appalachian Forest Coalition is lobbying to create wildland reserves and corridors for Virginia to Alabama. The coalition's goal is to protect and restore essential natural qualities of the Southern Appalachians at the expense of the current landowners and residents. The 22-member NGOs of the Southern Appalachian Forest Coalition have identified U.S. Forest Service land to convert from multiple-use to single-use protected wildlands as depicted in blue in their map. Although other ecologists would disagree, they believe that such a wildland system would protect the region's biological diversity over the long term. They also lobby to acquire private land or conservation easements to fill out gaps that are in light green within the existing Forest Service boundaries. Fortunately, Virginia has not passed legislation that would accelerate the process. Nonetheless, the program is still advancing piece by piece.
One of those pieces was the Virginia Ridge and Valley Act of 2005. The Forest Coalition successfully lobbied U.S. Representative Rich Buescher and U.S. Senator John Warner to introduce the act in both houses. Although the act was never voted out of committee, history of similar acts show that it will be reintroduced in successive Congresses until it passes or its dangers exposed.
In contrast, Maryland passed the Greenprint Act in 2001, which commissioned the identification of potential wildland hubs and corridors to prioritize their acquisition. The subsequent Green Infrastructure Assessment identified over 1.5 million acres of private land and 500,000 acres of government land needed to create the wildland hubs and corridors. The assessment defined specific hubs and corridors for later acquisition. When complete, the wildlands network would occupy 33% of the state. Targeting lands for future acquisition is called greenlining, which typically locks the land value at rock-bottom prices, thereby denying the landowner of any chance of receiving highest and best value for his or her land. In another example, the New Jersey Green Acres program was created in 1961 to meet New Jersey's growing recreation and conservation needs. In partnership with other NGOs and agencies listed here, the program is designed to, quote, achieve a system of interconnected open spaces whose protection will preserve and enhance New Jersey's natural environment, unquote. Since its inception, New Jersey has acquired over 1.25 million acres of private land to create protected open space and farmland across the state. 9 Green Acre bond issues and funding from the 1999 Garden State Preservation Trust Act provides up to $3.2 billion for land acquisition, past and future. Many of these lands are designated as wildland preserves, or as wildlife or watershed protection areas that are nearly protected. This represents a severe hardship on the rural landowner. Such an assault on private land is possible because New Jersey has the highest population density in the United States. 80% of New Jersey's population lives in urban and suburban areas, occupying only 25% of the state. These urban voters desire open land to which they can escape the congestion and the pollution of their own creation. Because of their high voting majority, urbanites can outvote rural voters 5-to-1 on rural land use restrictions. James Madison, one of the key architects of the U.S. Constitution, calls this the tyranny of the majority. New Jersey's Green Acres program was greatly assisted by Congress in 1978 when it passed the Pinelands National Reserve Act. Patterned after New York's Adirondack State Park, created in 1972, New Jersey's Pineland National Reserve gave the state power to regulate land use to protect the pinelands from any new development within the 1.1 million acre reserve. It also provided the state funding to buy private land. The New Jersey legislature supplemented the federal law by passing the 937,000-acre Pinelands Protection Act in 1979, which, amongst many other things, established a 295,000-acre preservation area in the heart of the Pinelands that virtually eliminated all development. New Jersey's non-elected Pinelands Commission developed highly restrictive ordinances for all private open land and communities within the reserve. Of this, the Kelly Green Preservation Area is the most restrictive, providing almost total protection, prohibiting almost all development on private land. The 1979 Pinelands Protection Act, plus other areas acquired under the Green Acres program, has resulted in the acquisition of over 1 million acres of former private property to be converted into open space, preservation, or wildlands. Notice how the protected areas are mostly in rural areas where rural citizens have little voice in what happens to them. The 2004 Highlands Conservation Act has accelerated this process by designating another area in New Jersey to receive more protection and federal money for land acquisition. Again, notice how this federal corridor does not overlap any urban or suburban area. The full weight of the program falls on rural citizens. Even so, wildlands biologists and environmentalists believe that many ecosystems in the state are underprotected, even if all government lands are converted from multiple use to single-use preservation. Environmentalists and the state already have plans to correct this perceived problem.
The New Jersey Green Acres Program and the New Jersey Conservation Foundation have teamed up to designate another 1 million acres in the state for open space and preservation, called the Garden State Greenways Program. The Greenways Program first identified all open space in each county. These are represented in light and dark green on the maps. Then interconnecting corridors called connections were defined between the open space. These connections are represented in lemon green. Although it's given a fancy name, it is still the Wildlands Project. Once identified, the location of the preserved lands are digitized. Those areas classed as preserved lands are shown in this map as red. Those private lands within red areas are future acquisition targets, which is called greenlining. The plan is to purchase as much of this land using conservation easements as possible, which strips the landowner of all development rights. Once the preserved open space is digitized, corridors that interconnect with the preserves are added. While most preserves and corridors are targeted for rural areas, urban areas are not immune. The goal of the Greenways program, according to their website, is to, quote, spiderweb this entire nation with so many green threads, principally along streams and ridges, that every citizen would only be minutes away from one, unquote. With this goal, it is not difficult to understand why these wildlands advocates believe that up to 1/2 of America must be converted to wildland reserves and corridors. No land in America is safe from this kind of wildlands assault. The loss of liberty can also come in the guise of something that should be very positive. For instance, most people desire to preserve our historical record through historical sites and restoration projects. However, innocent-sounding federal programs like the National Heritage Areas Program can have hidden traps that diminish property rights of local residents. Establishing a National Heritage Area allows the federal government to heavily influence local zoning regulations that diminish the rights of other property owners in the surrounding area. Many National Heritage Areas are also authorized to use federal funds for land acquisition and thus can create national parks within their boundaries. Others are openly lobbying for land acquisition and park creation. Property owners within these heritage areas must often contend with ideologically driven land trusts partnered with federal agencies to either acquire their land or restrict its use. Other programs like the Appalachian Forest Heritage Area can also impact local landowners as they seek to maintain viewsheds and historic cultural values on private land. New heritage areas are continuously promoted. 10 new National Heritage Areas were added in 2006. One of those that was proposed but was not accepted because of public opposition was the Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area. It would have transected 3 states and 8 counties. When the existing Shenandoah National Heritage Area is combined with the Appalachian Forest Heritage Area and the proposed Journey Through Hallowed Ground National Heritage Area, 29 counties in over 3 states are blocked in, giving the federal and state governments increased control over private property across multiple states.
But these activities are merely the first step. Environmental groups are applying heavy political pressure to acquire all private land within existing boundaries of federal land as soon as possible. Additionally, the Wildlands Project itself has identified certain lands outside existing federal boundaries for acquisition to provide corridors to isolated federal holdings. Unless stopped, aggressive land acquisition programs may soon be implemented across the entire Mid-Atlantic and Lower Lake States region and America.